All right, pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law and the governor's March 23rd, 2020 order imposing strict limitations of the number of people that may gather in one place, this meeting of the Yarmouth Water Resources Advisory Committee is being conducted via remote participation. All votes during this meeting will need to be conducted by roll call. No in-person attendance will be permitted, but every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access and participate in the proceedings as provided for in the order. Public participation will be permitted by allowing members of the public to join this meeting via Zoom or via the telephone. And Mr. Chairman, you can just take a roll call to enter into the meeting quorum. We can begin.
Okay, very good. I will vote aye. John DeLizzo,
Aye.
Tom Roach,
Aye.
Tom Barron,
Aye.
Spiro,
Present.
Tom Durkin,
Aye.
George Perkins.
Present.
Very good. Looks like we have six members on. All right, I will open the meeting. I believe the first part of business. Actually, I want to say something before we get going because somebody made a comment after the last meeting, and I don't blame you, about getting information out in a timely fashion. I know it's been frustrating, but with COVID, things move slowly. So anytime that Kyle or myself gets information, you get it. So unfortunately, some of what we went over as far as the cost recovery and whatnot last meeting was presented. We saw at the same time you did. So we will hope that in the future things will move faster, but it's just the way things are going. And I know it's making our job harder, but nobody's holding back on anything. And a couple of things happened over the weekend. One was an article in the Cape Cod Times, which was not well written, in my opinion. And of course, one of our radio talk show hosts yesterday decided he was going to say that we're fighting already with the other towns, even though we haven't done anything. So that's unfortunate because I think part of what we're going to talk about is just keeping our options open. And it's not picking a fight with anybody. It's just trying to make sure we stay on track time-wise to meet the DOT requirements and other things. So that's just my little statement. Just gets going with the meeting. Dave, are you doing a DHY status update?
Well, Kurt, if I could start that, I can probably follow
Okay.
a similar format to what I did with the Board of Selectmen last week, which just kind of highlights the memos and gets into a few of the other details. And if there's any specific questions the committee members have about the memos, then Dave could jump in and talk about those. But I think it's important to at least present those. As you mentioned, Mr. Chair, there was an awful lot of information that's been available over the last month. It's been a very active period. And I think a good way to present that, or at least digest it, is to briefly look at those memos. Those help document a lot of the things that have been ongoing. So if that seems like an appropriate format, I could follow that.
Okay, whatever works for you.
Okay, great. The first one, the first memo, they were all ones that Kyle has forwarded to you, is dated February 4th of 2021. It's an important memo because it's entitled Proposed Effluent Recharge and Nitrogen Loading Impacts in the Bass River Watershed. As the committee's well aware, there's been some questions about the impact from this DHY partnership and just wastewater recharge in general on the Bass River. And so this memo, again, dated February 4th of 2021, shows that there's environmental impacts to the discharge site at Bass River are all positive, and there's an overall improvement to water quality in Bass River. So I think that was an important element to note and to demonstrate. I think CDM Smith has also done similar documentation for some other watersheds in Dennis and elsewhere. So I think it's important to cover that, and just want to make sure the committee has no questions about that. And if so, I'm sure David could answer those for us. Any thoughts about that particular memo, or any concerns from the committee about that?
I have a related question, and I keep getting approached about why are we not trying to find a reuse for the effluent as opposed to putting it under the golf course? you know, the points that are made to me about piping it back to different places that aren't bad, but I'm curious about what are the big picture implications as far as costs and infrastructure that would be required, let's say, to send it back to the motels or whoever, and they use it as a water reuse or irrigation or something like that. Would you say it probably requires some kind of storage on the various sites? I imagine it's more pump and obviously more piping. Would that be correct?
Well, there's a lot of complications with that, and obviously CDM Smith is going to have better technical information than I. But with regards to the use of that, Kurt, just as you referred to, there's complications with regards to storage. We do some of this at the Bayberry Hills Golf Course and specifically the links. And in order to do that appropriately at the right time of year and when the golf course demands that, or in this particular case, maybe when users, residential or commercial users demand that, we have a 10.5 million gallon storage tank over at the septic treatment facility to store that. So, there are complications we would need to consider, costs we would need to consider. I'm sure that, one of the primary focuses to date for our wastewater plant is trying to cost containment. That's one of the reasons we're talking about DHY it's much more cost effective to do some of those types of things. So we've explored a lot of things to try to contain the costs, try to demonstrate that we can do this as effectively as possible with at minimal cost. And with that said, that two pipe or that second pipe solution is going to be a significant increased cost. If that is something that the committee is interested in having us look into, we certainly can. The Board of Selectmen was, I think, looking for a response on that. I think that's what the chairman had also indicated. We probably should have a response on that going forward, but there would be significant costs. The next memo that I'll cover once we talk about this one a little bit are going to be related to costs, and the costs have gone up and will continue to go up every year we delay. But if every time we add additional elements to the program, that's also going to be a cost driver as well. So those are just my 2 cents on that, Kurt.
Another point on my part too is I imagine there's a huge seasonality to the use of the effluent. Of course, it's being generated seasonally to a certain extent, but the use of it on a seasonality basis would be something to consider too. What do you do with the effluent when you're not using it fast enough?
Right. It's likely we would need to have some kind of recharge component just for that overflow. Absolutely.
Anybody else in the committee have any questions on this issue or comments? Like it, hate it, whatever. Tom Barron?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. My experience was with the Metropolitan District Commission and then became Mass Water Resources. The reuse of products from the treatment of sewage up there in Boston Harbor took the form of making fertilizer for local gardens, etc. But certainly nothing with the DHY proposal is going to come anywhere near the volume or the capability of doing anything significant with the solid waste, other than whatever disposition is done at the treatment plant site itself. Piping effluent, treated effluent all over the map, as Jeff has said, is not cost effective at all. Not for a three-town joint effort. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Tom was just speaking about something too. I know sludge disposal is a headache already, and margins could be a bit of one on the sewage treatment. Is that something that could be put through that composter if we ever get to that point that we've been working on?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I could comment on that very briefly. It wasn't really one of the agenda items. It might warrant its own agenda item in the future if we'd like to discuss that further. But that anaerobic digester project up at 50 Workshop Road that's really, related to the septage facility and that site is ongoing. We're continuing to explore that. We've had some good discussions recently as we've started to work on intermunicipal agreements with different communities that would be providing feedstock to that facility. So that is continuing to move forward. It's moving forward very slowly, but it's certainly, I think, an important element with regards to how we deal with the biosolids associated with wastewater treatment, as well as some food, wastes as well, that could all be part of that. So it's still moving forward as potentially within Yarmouth, but a regional facility. The Cape Cod Commission is also doing some investigation on this. So the ultimate location might not necessarily be 50 Workshop Road. It might be the military base, but there is some ongoing discussion about that to try to find a cost-effective solution. Because as you've indicated, Mr. Chair, that is a very expensive cost element of any of these facilities is the sludge disposal.
Yeah, okay, maybe, I think that's a good idea. Maybe when we get further down the road, that'd be a discussion topic. And I just wanted to kind of throw it out there that might be a possibility of a sludge disposal solution.
Mr. Chairman, if I might add, this is David Young.
Yeah.
We are actually proposing to do an indirect reuse through the DHY portion anyway, by applying the very highly treated effluent, which should be considered a product, not a waste material, to the golf course at Bass River, by recharging that groundwater and then using some of the groundwater as the irrigation source water. We're not pumping directly into the irrigation lines, but that water will still have some nitrogen in it, which will gain benefit to the golf course and help offset some of the commercial fertilizer use. So it's an indirect use. We're just using the groundwater table as the storage vessel versus, as Jeff said, the 10.5 million gallon tank that you have over at the septage plant. So, and you hit the nail on the head. There is a big seasonality factor that has to be considered. So you really need to try to identify large water users. We have put in many of the documents that, we need to try to identify some of those. And one of the ones we had thought of was potential for a truck washing facility at the Dennis DPW site, because that's where their water would be generated and could be recycled back to the treatment plant there. But any other large water users that could be identified or were looking to come in to either of the communities would certainly be a benefit for that use. Just piping it down Route 28, the most expensive road to build in the whole program, and with the intent that someone may want to use it, for a hotel to use it for toilet flushing or something like that, they've got to redo their whole plumbing system to meet codes and on and on. So it does become very expensive.
Yeah, my thought on that was if you were building a brand new development, say an industrial park or something like that, where you're starting from scratch with all your infrastructure, it would certainly be much easier. But I did tell the person who asked me this that I would address it. Because I don't disagree with him. I just, like you say, the cost can get out of hand pretty quickly with this and all the other things that go with it, where our time is getting shorter and shorter also. And you got to question how many new properties will actually be built that could make use of this treated effluent on, say, on Route 28. Anybody have anything else on that issue? Okay. You still on?
Okay.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, the next item in that update in the next memo is a memo that was updated with the date of February 2021. It was originally from a July of 2020 memo from CDM Smith, summary of the Bass River Golf Course effluent recharge alternatives capital cost. And although I think the committee has seen this previously, it does indicate and document some of the discussions with the Gulf Enterprise Committee with regards to their interest in pursuing the master plan. So as you can see on the screen that Kyle's sharing here, it's the kind of the middle of the road option. It's not the simply restore option, and it's not a higher level rebuild of the course option, but it's what's being referred to as the master plan option. And the bottom line, as I think we've talked about before, is that's a $10 to $12 million additional costs associated with that are not DHY costs. And so David Young and myself have talked with the Gulf Enterprise Committee just recently on March 15th. And through that process, they're coming up with some recommendations for the Board of Selectmen and for your committee to consider with regards to how to pay for that. So that's kind of where that stands with regard to an update on that particular component. I don't know if there's any questions about Bass River Golf Course or what's being proposed there or any of those costs, but that is the update with regard to that component.
Okay, I know there was some comment at the selectmen's meeting the other night about is the resurgence of golf's popularity a temporary blip, or is it a trend that people say, well, I do want to get back outside and I want to keep playing golf, because there is some concern that the enterprise account will actually be able to pay for whatever it is that they want on Bass River. So I think there has to be a reality check along the way to make sure that whatever it is going to work financially on the rebuild of the golf course.
Yes, I think that's to be determined once we hear from the Gulf Enterprise Committee as to what they're proposing and how to pay for that. I know that's something that they're actively working on, and hopefully we'll hear something about that shortly.
Okay, very good.
Question: Do these projections include the suggested new building for the
clubhouse?
The clubhouse, excuse me. Yes.
Yes, the short answer is yes. The 10 to 12 million range covers a new clubhouse. Yes.
And that would be factored into the Gulf Enterprise Committee's finance plan when they come back to the selectmen.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Would the effluent be saleable to potentially any private buyer that could make a use of it? One in mind might be Blue Rock Golf Course. We have a bit of a reverse precedent with the talk about the solar farm contributing to the cost of the project. Just putting it out there for query.
Well, I think the short answer to that is anything's possible, surely. I mean, some of the communities that I'm familiar with this returning of the reclaimed water back to commercial or residential users happens to be in Florida. And I do know for a fact that at least one of the communities in Florida that I'm aware of does charge for that. They charge less than they do potable water. So obviously people want to use that before they use potable water for irrigation purposes. But yes, I think just like David said earlier, it should be considered a beneficial element, a commodity versus something we're just looking to dispose of.
Yeah, the issue there, John, would be, what is Blue Rock paying for their water now? Do they have an issue with the quantity that they can get through whatever permit they have? And so then what's the economy of scale for them to switch over and use reclaimed water instead? My guess is they're either using groundwater wells and it's the cost of pumping it, or I don't know if they acquire any water, purchase any water from the town, but yeah, the pipe will be going right by there.
Yeah, that's what came to mind. It was so close.
We can investigate that. I would imagine that if you treat it as a product, it's got to be a competitive product. If you show them the savings by saying it's less to hook into our pipe versus pumping your own or buying it through the water department, I think that certainly they're going to look at that as a business.
Absolutely. If there's no other questions, I can go on to the next memo, the next part of the update.
Okay.
And those are the next two components are the two newer memos. They're both dated, and actually I think there's a third related memo that's at the same date of March 10th of 2021 from CDM Smith, mostly related to cost updates. And the first one, and it's long awaited, things that we talked about with this committee about how each year we wait adds to the cost of the plan. So the first one is a summary of updates to the DHY Clean Waters Community Partnership. It's a project opinion of probable costs. And that indicates it went from the costs we've been using for a while now, we're based upon 2022. And now this new memo, which if there's questions, David can cover in a little more depth, goes to the end of 2024. So just increasing the cost by a couple of years has added to the cost of this program. And I think what was shared with the selectmen last week was that we can expect going forward that it'd be about 3 to 5% cost increase every year. So if the committee has any detailed questions about that, I'm sure David could answer those.
Yeah, just to give a brief summary for those who didn't get a chance to look at it in detail, the cost update reflected the cost recommendations that came out of the peer review that were presented back in February of 2020. We updated some of the costs that we've been seeing from recent bids. We updated some minor tweaks that have been made to different portions of each of the community's collection systems. But we also pushed all the costs forward. They used to be midpoint year 2022, but with the delays, we've now pushed everything to the end of the year 2024 through a projection just by escalating the cost at 3 to 5% annually. So, as Jeff indicated, each year the town waits, you're looking at that, on a $300 million plus program, 3%, plus you're adding $10 million a year just through inflation. So, that's certainly something to be considered as the community moves forward. But that just reflected, and then we created the same tables that you had previously reviewed prior to these updates, being the cost of the town doing it on its own, the cost to the town for being part of the DHY partnership, both capital costs, operation and maintenance costs, and then the projected savings from those. And then we did it for the phase 1 program and showed the breakdown in more detail for each town by collection system, the conveyance, meaning pumping stations, and the treatment plant and effluent recharge. It's very similar to what you saw before. Yes, for Yarmouth to be part of the DHY, cost you a little more in your collection system costs because you have to convey your wastewater over to Dennis, but you have significant savings in the treatment plant, even though you would be majority owner of capacity, you're sharing it with 2 other communities to help pay for that. But the real savings to Yarmouth is in the operation and maintenance costs on an annual basis, because instead of paying for it all on your own, you are sharing that cost. So that over the operating life of the program is truly where your savings are. So very similar to what you saw before, though. Just the numbers have increased a little, but percentages along the way are very similar.
Do we have any questions? I don't know if you had it somewhere later in the presentation, but what are some of the drop dead dates we need, Dave, to meet design requirements for DOT and things like that? I know we were getting concerned about being ready for that.
Yeah, I can cover that a little bit, Mr. Chair. It is something I was going to touch upon slightly, well, after we cover the rest of the memos, if that's okay, because that kind of goes towards, where do we go from now?
Okay.
Yeah, that feeds into your town meeting articles and everything else and status of the other communities.
Right.
All right.
So if there's no other questions on that memo, the other memo, and it's been something that's been discussed at the DHY subgroup level, and so we wanted to make sure we were capturing all of that information for everyone. And that is another memo dated March 10th of 2021, which is a summary of proposed DHY effluent recharge sites with timelines. There's been a lot of discussion about Bass River Golf Course, but what should be made clear for everyone is there are other effluent recharge sites in all three communities, and at what point would they need to be brought online. So that really was the purpose of that that other memo, and that the committee has. Just wanted to make sure everyone has that and is aware of those different impacts. So although, like I said before with one of the other memos, we're talking about more specifically the impacts to Bass River Golf Course, but there's other golf courses and other recharge sites in other communities that'll be impacted as well. And so when we're talking about revenue or other components of impact, it's important to note what those are. And so Kyle's really showing what is the summary for that memo, that table, kind of showing when the different recharge areas are brought online, what their capacities are. It is based upon how the system is built out and what those might look like. So David, I don't know if you have any other comments about that, but I think it was a good way to lay that out for everyone to see.
Yeah, I'll just add two other additional points. I think you covered a lot of it. But just to indicate that, a lot of people have asked, how is the priority of these sites established? And it was based off the subgroup that's been meeting for 4 years now for DHY monthly, deciding that, the best approach and the most cost-effective approach was to pick these sites with the largest capacity closest to the treatment plant location, which is at the Dennis DPW. So the largest capacity closest was in Yarmouth at the Bass River Golf Course. The second largest closest was the Harwich DPW site off of Queen Anne Road. And then the third one, the next closest would have been the second site in Dennis, over off of Old Bass River Road and Crowell Road. All four of those first sites have had more detailed and specific groundwater modeling conducted. So we feel very comfortable with the proposed capacity at those sites based on the work that's been done. The last three, they have had some conceptual modeling done, no field work. But you can see they're much smaller capacities too, until you get to the end, but that puts us up at more, and we may get more capacity out of the original 4 to 6 sites. I may not even need that 6th site depending on where the flows are. It's still up to the communities to do their collection system and therefore generate the flow to be brought to the treatment plant and how much capacity they choose to buy into that plant. So just wanted to bring those two items up. That's all.
Okay. Anybody have any questions about that?
Okay, Mr. Chair, if there's no questions, those were the memos that were included. I just want to make sure that we at least touched upon them for the committee to make sure that there was at least a summary overview and answered any questions that the committee might have. But the next portion of the DHY update is to really talk about what, and answer the question that you had just a moment ago, Mr. Chairman, and that was, what does that look like for Yarmouth? For Yarmouth, we still have an article on the spring town meeting for the DHY agreement, and we've been doing some regular ongoing discussions with Mass DOT on project coordination. We've had meetings really and discussions about the two big components, and it's not all of our phase 1. I think as the committee is aware, but there are some significant portions of our phase 1 that Mass DOT also has project plans for. and that's primarily the Bass River Bridge and the Route 28 North Main Street, Old Main Street intersection, which it looks like those projects are being combined. And then also the Route 28 resurfacing project from the Parkers River Bridge to the Barnstable Town line. So those are two pretty significant MassDOT projects, which we have the opportunity to save a lot of money by coordinating with them. And so we've been doing so. There's project managers assigned for both projects from MassDOT. So we've had some very good dialogue recently, and we'll continue to over the next couple of weeks about those two projects. But with that said, the most recent project schedule that we've been given for what I would say is the first of those two projects is that Bass River Bridge, Route 28 North Main Street, Old Main Street project. And the 75% design plans for that project are due early in 2022, according to the current schedule. And in order to make sure that we're properly coordinating the wastewater and water infrastructure into that design, they need to be part of the 75% design plans. And so that's really what our schedule looks like to make sure that we're properly coordinating with the MassDOT project. So that's a little bit more detail on when those are due. It does take time to develop the information. CDM Smith is actively working on the design information for that project with Bass River Bridge, as well as the intersection project. And we have a contract with them to do so. And so they're on the way, but we need to make sure that the information is also incorporated with the design team for MassDOT. So that just doesn't happen immediately. We need to make sure that we give our design team appropriate time in which to get the work done. So we can't just decide one day and expect to have it done the next day. So, that's I think what's been generally talked about in these discussions, as well as our wastewater planning meetings, is a 2-year design period, and we are in that for much of our first phase of wastewater collection system. So we're at a point where we need to make some decisions, and that's where we stand. So I think one of the big decisions is where do we collection system piping could be pretty consistent with regards to whether it's a DHY treatment option or it's a Yarmouth treatment option. The collection system piping is going to look very similar, but where you pump it, where's that force main going? Is that going over the bridge, or is that going over to Buck Island Road? So it's decisions like that that need to be made pretty quickly, and that's an oversimplification. I'm sure David and Cara could explain that in much more depth, but there is some pump station design work that also is impacted by some of the design considerations. So we're at a point where we need to make some decisions quickly in order to be appropriately designing those components. So that's really where we stand from the Yarmouth standpoint.
Mr. Barron?
Yes, I'm the representative from the planning board. Jeff, are you aware of the letter that was received by planning board? It's dated February 2nd. We did not consider it in planning. The first opportunity for us to consider the content of the letter, which was just a one-page document with a map showing the limits of Barnstable to Parker River. But the letter was very nondescript. It had very little information. It had a general description of what was being planned for the all they said was resurfacing of 28. The planning board prepared a letter to respond to this, saying that we needed more information from DPW, from MassDOT. We have not received, to my knowledge, we haven't received that yet. But the initial letter on March 3 that we considered, I mean, the meeting on March 3 that we considered the letter, prompted me to ask Dave Young about what the 2010 plans for Yarmouth had been for the piping in that first portion of the project. And Dave came up with a very interesting comment that the Mass DOT, they claim not to have seen the 2010 drawings. And they also claimed that they have the right to locate their pipes and lay out where they want, since it's their road. This would indicate to me that some of the so-called coordination that has been we've been hearing about, someone isn't on the same page at Mass DOT. Either that, or the message just isn't getting out. And I just thought I'd bring it up and see if there was any response.
Well, Tom, I appreciate you bringing that up. I can assure you that there is active, ongoing coordination with that project. Tom Courier is the project manager for that project, and he's very proactive. He's, in my opinion, one of the better Mass DOT project managers. And with that said, we've had ongoing dialogue with him. I'm aware of the letter that you were talking about from Mass DOT, and that's what they call early project coordination. They send it out well before the 25% design public hearing, which is obviously another major milestone of the project. But they just want to make sure that there isn't anything that the community might know of that they should be aware of. You know, they say it, you know, whether it's any future plans, and wastewater would certainly be a big one of those. Water infrastructure improvements is another one. We've also recently directed Open Cape to begin discussions with Mass DOT as part of those projects if they have any interest in burying fiber. So there's a lot of active ongoing discussions. And some of the letters that have been sent out, like these early project coordination letters, are more form letters than anything else. We've been assured on all of the projects that I just mentioned that we're coordinating with Mass DOT that as long as we get the design information for wastewater or water utility information incorporated into the 75% design plans, which we're well far away from that. Like I said, we don't even have the 25% yet. But as long as we get them for the 75%, that we will be properly coordinating with their project. So that's ongoing, and I don't really have too much else to add to that. David, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I just want to add to clarify that, those were two comments Tom made at the very first coordination meeting that we attended. And Yarmouth DPW has been doing a great job coordinating. They pulled that meeting together. So the discussion items were that, yeah, that may be their position, but let's look at the plans that were developed previously. Let's coordinate this. Let's see if they can move their stormwater structures. Let's see how it fits with the lane that they're planning to add to the roadway, and on and on. So there's a lot of discussion to still go on, even though, yes, those comments were made. So it shows where we're starting from, but that's why we're having the coordination meetings.
Okay, thank you very much.
Anybody else? We talk a lot about the western part of 28 and the Bass River Bridge and the intersection. What about the eastern part of 28? Is that on anybody's radar? Or are we going to lay pipe and wait for them to come back on the other side of the bridge? Or what's the thought on that right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. The current thought on that is we're going to have a Yarmouth only project for that component, as we would for South Shore Drive or anything else that's part of that phase one that's a significant component. So there's going to be our own project as part of that. Mass DOT does not have plans to reconstruct all of Route 28 from town line to town line. A pretty significant component portion of it they're reconstructing for us, probably 60% would be my guess. And so us coordinating with their project saves us a lot of money, but there's that other 40% that we're going to have to do as our own permitted project. So We'll go through the design as we typically would, and then we'll apply to Mass DOT for a permit to do the work essentially on our own. We'll have to do our own procurement, our own project oversight, and all of that will have to be done as a standalone project, like many other communities have for their projects. The Chatham projects, the Harwich projects, we're all hearing about. Those are town projects that are just getting a permit to do so, and that would have to be what we would do for that smaller portion.
And on David's cost estimates, does that include the savings of working with DOT, or is that making assumptions that we would be doing the whole thing on our own?
Yeah, no, because it's not totally known at this time, we've costed it out as though it was a Yarmouth only, so we're hoping to get that increased savings, particularly the paving cost for that. So this is very
Okay.
conservative.
Okay. So a question I'm surprised, I don't know why I didn't think of it, but nobody's asked previously that I know of. So does the committee have any more questions at this point? Okay, Jeff, you still
Yeah, the other
presenting right now?
Yes, and the other piece of DHY, and this is the more difficult piece, and I think what the selectmen are more interested in, the RAC, exploring some different options for, really relate to Harwich's and Dennis's positions. And so, given that I don't have anything written from those two communities to relay to the committee, I'll do my best to summarize those as I did for the Board of Selectmen. And currently, the Harwich position is they're not going to have a DHY agreement town meeting article, and they're looking to do some more analysis. And at this point, they weren't able to commit to a fall town meeting for 2021. Harwich doesn't typically have fall town meetings. They were expecting that they might need to have one to deal with Monomoy schools, but they were leery of having two major articles for a fall town meeting, one being wastewater and one being their school agreement. And so at this point, they weren't sure they could commit to a fall town meeting, but they were certainly willing to consider that. And what I should say about both of these town positions that we'll cover here and talk about a little bit is we have no more DHY subgroup meetings until June. So there's just so much uncertainty with how town meeting warrants are playing out, and then getting through that process for the spring, that communities wanted to have a chance to get past their town meetings and then have discussions about the fall. So some of this is making certain assumptions, but at this point, that was Harwich's position. And I'm happy to talk about Dennis' position unless there's any questions about Harwich.
I think
just to
Yeah, go
add
ahead,
on
Dave.
Harwich, I think their party line is that, they're not saying no, they're saying they need more time. And they're leaving it at that.
My issue at this point with Howard is that 4 years is not enough time. I'm not sure how much is going to be. If they had at least at the last DHY meeting, if they had at least committed to calling for a special town meeting to handle this issue, maybe some others, I'd have a greater level of comfort. But for them to be so wishy-washy about the answer being, well, we don't usually have a fall meeting, so whatever. That's not helpful to us at this point. So you want to move on to Dennis? I have some other comments about that, but if you want to move on to whatever their position is right now.
Absolutely. So Dennis is planning to postpone the DHY agreement article. They regularly have fall town meetings, and so they don't see it as too significant of an issue because they can just take up business that they regularly would do at a fall town meeting. So they're a little more comfortable with the items that they would have and they would be able to address at a fall town meeting. But their reasoning for postponing was primarily related to COVID. They have had a hard time, as their own admission, with regards to outreach and reaching voters on these virtual platforms. Personally, I think we had a pretty successful virtual outreach forum in the fall. Many of you were on that. And I think that was very effective with the turnout and the good questions that we had and the connection. But Dennis's position is there didn't have a similar type of feel. They've done some virtual meetings, and they just felt that they weren't well attended, and they couldn't get the message out. So their position is that because of COVID and the inability to reach and educate their voters, they were looking to postpone. They also had a concern with regards to Harwich's interest in postponing, and they, feeling that we should all kind of do it together at the same time. But their primary expressed concern was because of COVID and needed to do some more outreach was their position.
The other thing about Dennis is that I believe they lost about half of their town hall employees to COVID or quarantining. So their ability to get things done in Dennis has been severely hampered in the recent past, which I'm sure didn't help much. My feeling when we talked to DHY was, if that's what they need to get to fall, I felt okay with that. Again, Harwich, I'm really concerned about where they're at, but I think if Dennis is willing to go to fall and we work together with him, I think that would be okay with me. But again, I'd like to hear other people's perspective on all this. Lee? Looks like you're muted, Lee.
Lee, you're muted.
Thank you. What would be the downside to town of Yarmouth voting for DHY at this point, rather than wait until the fall to do it all together, kumbaya, whatever?
Well, I would think, one of the things that I think is problematic is there's a bunch of dates attached to the DHY agreement, which would have to be updated. And I would think the other two towns would have to agree to that update. And again, that lack of certainty that Harwich is really on board in a timely fashion, I think would be a problem. At least some people, especially the board, have expressed that also. But
yeah, I personally, I think that Harwich is a smaller portion of the whole package, and it just seems to me they're not as significant as, of course, Dennis and Yarmouth. And it just seems to me, if Harwich eventually says, well, we're not going to do anything for 5 years or so, how would that affect the DHY? I mean, we wouldn't have DHY, we'd have DY. But can we move on the assumption that Harwich can come in at a later date and Yarmouth and Dennis can move along as though we're all gonna be together at some point?
If I might, Mr. Chairman?
Yep.
The downside of voting right now, Lee, is that the agreement is written around all three towns being part of it. And the special legislation requires the agreement to be presented to each town meeting for approval of the communities that are going to be part of the agreement. So right now, you don't know whether it's DHY or DY at some point in the future. So you wouldn't know what agreement to bring to town meeting. The second part of your question is, and it's become the obvious question in the last week or so, is what about a Dennis-Yarmouth agreement? One, you may not need special legislation because you could do that just through an intermunicipal agreement. On the other hand, if you did want to create a separate entity, you would need to go back and revise the special legislation. But the agreement could be very similar, just a different makeup of the commissioners. The other operating rules and everything would be minor tweaks as presented in the agreement. So that could certainly be done and brought to the fall town meetings if Dennis and Yarmouth felt that they could push that agreement through education in their local communities. We've done back of the envelope cost. You know, we're probably going to do some more detail just to prove it, but back of the envelope, because Harwich, as you indicated, was such a small percentage, you know, Dennis and Yarmouth are sharing that 15%, and it doesn't change really the cost at all because the facility's a little bit smaller, but you pick up 1 or 2% more. It's not a big deal. So the cost savings is still going to be there through economy of scale for the two working together. The question is, you know, are the two towns willing to work together on wastewater and do it with just two towns and put in the agreement that Harwich could join as a either customer to the DY entity, whatever that looks like in the future, or whatever, and maybe join even at a premium because Dennis and Yarmouth had moved forward and it cost them a little more to come in later. You know, all those options are on the table, but that's probably the approach that makes the most sense.
So from a conservative point of view, you're saying maybe it makes sense not for us to have anything on the warrant right now for DHY, even though it could be on the warrant, it could get approved by town meeting, and we would still have to go before the voters at some point. I just think that Yarmouth should be stepping forward in some fashion to be the leader in this whole thing, to demonstrate to the other towns that we really want to go. Now, we don't need special legislation if it were just two towns, right?
Correct. You do that through an intermunicipal agreement. Wouldn't be a separate entity as the special legislation was, but could be set up to be that way and act that way. One thing I would add to Dennis too, they have indicated that they will have articles for moving forward with upfront survey and preliminary design because unlike Yarmouth and Harwich, their collection system and treatment plant location don't change at all.
Right.
Whether they're doing their own in-town or doing the DHY partnership or a DY partnership. It's just the size of the treatment plant and where the effluent recharge would go. Obviously, Dennis only wouldn't be going to Bass River. But they are intending to show that they are moving forward. And, you know, the survey, you know this, the survey takes a fair amount of time up front just to get that going. So between now and next fall, you know, that would be a lot of the time in just getting that up and running. Similar to what, you know, we're doing some of that for Yarmouth now, So
here's another question for you. If, let's say Yarmouth and Dennis are going to go together and we don't need special legislation, and later on, Harwich wants to become a customer of DY. Do you need special legislation for that?
No, they could just become a customer.
So they wouldn't have any voice in how the operations are running. Well, I suppose we'd have some kind of an agreement with them.
Well, that's one scenario. You could create the DHY partnership at that time if the three towns so chose, but I'm just saying you wouldn't need to.
Right. Okay.
Tom Roach, I think you've been waiting a while, right?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
What would be the impact on Dennis if, you know, by Howard's just pulling back?
I'm not sure I understand the full question, Tom.
Well, in
Cost
regards to, you know, Dennis talking about going forward with Yarmouth.
Yeah.
And then what impact would it be if Howard just held back, decided to go at a later date? What impact would it have on Dennis based on the agreements that they have?
As I indicated We haven't run the full cost, but back of the envelope indicates that the cost savings for Dennis and Yarmouth would be very similar to what they're seeing for the full DHY. But because Harwich was 15% or less.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
you're just splitting that, and that's a minor portion of your cost. So the cost savings with the two largest capacity owners is still very similar.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
Tom Barron?
Yeah, what Dave is talking about in different agreements, it's going to take time to rewrite and prepare. And will that be able to be done by fall town meeting? Or what sort of timeline are you talking about?
Yeah, if the framework of the current DHY agreement were used, there's very few changes that need to be made to that. As I said, the biggest component would probably be the makeup of the commissioners.
Right.
And the
And
special,
then getting community input again on that and selling it prior to town meeting.
and the special legislation?
Well, again, it would need to be decided whether you want to revise the special legislation to create a separate entity partnership, or if you want to do it through an intermunicipal agreement. Two parties or two communities can sign intermunicipal agreements now just by have votes of the Board of Selectmen.
So the legislature wouldn't be involved because there's the time delay factor.
The special legislation doesn't need to be involved. It could be, or it could not be, depending on the route selected.
Thank you.
John?
Yeah, I'm concerned that, just speaking for myself, that the project may be stalling. We've come over the 3 years I've been on the committee through a very different environment, just life being what it is. We've had COVID. My reading of the tea leaves a few years ago was that we'd have pretty clear sailing with Dennis and Harwich, and it appears that may not be the case. I don't know that. I'm not privy to exactly how those conversations are going. We're starting to see the early stages of inflation. Not an economist, but having lived a little life, I sense that costs are going to change, and that magic moment for action, my sense is on our doorstep. I, for one, would somewhat subscribe to what Lee was talking about earlier, and that Yarmouth is kind of the lead player in this. And my sense is that if Yarmouth seizes the moment and we begin to take action, perhaps it makes sense to have the DHY agreement voted by the citizens as a flag, as a signal that Yarmouth is serious about this. Yarmouth also ought to be talking about potentially going it alone. The other towns turn out not to be as cooperative as we'd like. It may be that the costs dictate it makes sense for Yarmouth to go ahead, even though that may be more expensive. I'm not saying in an absolute sense, but I think it's worth considering. So I'm worried that if the conversations continue too much longer, we may be backing ourselves into a difficult place. Thanks.
Well, I think what you're getting at was a concern that one or two of your selectmen expressed the other night, in that the continued cost increases to Yarmouth just due to inflation may be offsetting some of the cost savings of continuing to wait for DHY, particularly if you waited a year, say everybody waits till spring of 2020 town meeting, and not knowing whether the three towns would even pass it at that point. You've added another $10 million to your program without doing anything.
Exactly.
Well, it just seems to me that Dennis is a willing partner. They're dragging their feet at the moment, but it sounds to me like they're willing to put forward some money to start doing designs and so forth. It seems more logical that Yarmouth and Dennis together would be a very workable solution. My concern is that if we go it alone, we lose out on the opportunity to get additional grants, either federal or state, because we're not going to be regional. I just think that a regional approach to this is the best approach. And I personally would rather see the plant in Dennis. I think they have a better site than we have in Yarmouth. And I just think it would be the wrong way to go for Yarmouth to be alone. I think Yarmouth and Dennis have been able to get through other regional agreements, albeit difficult at times. But the two towns have the most wastewater. We can still maintain a regional approach to things and open ourselves up to more grant opportunities. And from a financial standpoint, I get the feeling that both towns are very strong in that and ready to go. I don't see why Yarmouth and Dennis don't consider having outside annual town meetings where they can get better participation. It really, if you have an outside meeting, you set up a date for the meeting and have an alternate for a rain date and move forward both towns and have the article on there. And if Harwich doesn't fall into play, we take the DHY agreement and slim it down to a DY agreement and move forward and still have this regional plant. And Harwich can come in later as a customer if that's the way it's going to be, and we'll still be fine and we'll be on track. I'm concerned that the federal government's going to come out with all these infrastructure funds, and if we're not ready to go, we're going to lose it. And that would be a shame. And on top of that, you've got this situation with the conservative law, whatever. They've got a lawsuit going with Hyannis. What's this? If we start dragging our feet, are we next in line to get sued? I don't know. Just seems crazy. And we're all waiting for 15% on Harwich. Forget them. If they don't want to come in, they can come in later as a customer and we'll charge them double.
I put together a list of questions the other day when this first came up, I've been thinking about it, adding to it. So I think some of the questions we need to ask is the SRF 0% protected? Is the debt forgiveness protected if we do a two-town solution? David already answered this, a YD versus a DHY cost comparison to go two-town versus three. Can we still find a way to secure the $1 million bond bill to help with design of the regional parts of it? I think, and I suggested this to one of our selectmen, that I think they should, do a personal reach out to the people in Dennis, because people are trying to pick a fight for us instead of us picking our own fight, which I think is totally unnecessary. It's unfortunately, there's some personalities getting in the way of the business of the two towns in this, especially in this particular issue. And I was thinking about another option is that what if Howard stayed in at a DHY level just to build the plant, but they did their piping and whatever later. you know, that would protect their rights in the plant. They wouldn't be paying the operation costs. They would just be paying for their share of the plant, which again, it's been a fairly minor percentage. So it just, excuse me, those are some things I've thought about. I reached out to Tim Whalen, but I haven't heard back from him yet. Because I had talked to him a while back and he said that if he needed to refile legislation, he'd be glad to do it. So if we can have a serious conversation with Dennis and that's where it goes, or like I said, if Howard wants to stay in and participate in the plant and then do the rest of their infrastructure later, to me, that would be another way out. And they would build at today's prices and then they could use it later on. I don't know if they've even thought about that, but it's probably not a bad idea. So anybody else have anything along those lines that maybe we should ask people and see what the answers to those type of questions would be?
Yes,
Well, Mr.
Kurt.
Chairman, before you go there, I can answer two of those questions for you. The first
Okay.
one regarding 0% interest loan, if it were just Dennis and Yarmouth, that would be yes. Perfect example is Harwich got 0% interest loan for their collection system because they're going to Chatham as a regional solution. And then the last one was, is Harwich considered just doing the treatment plant? And yes, they have, but it becomes a way of how they're paying for it. And, it's tough to sell at town meeting to buy a treatment plant and not having anyone connecting to it, but yet you're having all the ratepayers, taxpayers in Harwich pay for it. So that's why they are looking at rephasing their implementation plan so that they could send some wastewater to the plant for whatever purchase capacity they chose to buy into initially. I know they're looking at a smaller amount of flow than we had originally assumed, but that's reflected in the most recent cost update. So I don't know the answer to the line item in the environmental bond bill.
And is my understanding correct that their funding is mostly on the tax rate, the property tax rate?
Yes, they had other components when they first adopted it, but to date, everything has been put on the general tax rate.
So they look at more overrides or debt exclusions that we might necessarily, with our plan, to fund whatever part of it they may be involved in.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned the 0%. Would you say the debt forgiveness portion would still be good? Any reason to think it wouldn't be?
Well, the debt forgiveness would be based on each community. Being part of DY, it would be a combination of those two and what tier they fall into. I do know, and I haven't seen the revisions proposed yet, but they are looking to revise the whole SRF rating system, meaning how points are given out. Regionalization will still remain high for getting points, but they are restructuring the whole SRF program this coming year.
Weren't income levels part of that consideration? And
Yeah, the debt forgiveness is based on per capita income in the community. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So, Kurt,
Yeah, hear a voice, Spiro.
are you not?
I wasn't sure who it was. I was just looking down at my notepad.
Yeah, well, that explains why my raised hand wasn't seen, right? You're not on the screen?
I'm not on the screen, you are, but I was reading my questions and writing notes with Dave's answers.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack and respond to here. I'd just rather go back to where the selectmen left off. At their last meeting, they were looking for some feedback or some input from us. They took this question up of going it alone fairly seriously, I thought, listening in on them. It's a question of waiting on a partner that sounds like eventually wants to join us, but they're not in the same hurry that we are. And by the way, they control our destiny because the plant is in their town. So they could very well pull the rug out at the last minute. We would be holding nothing. At the same time, I'm not a big fan of DHY. I think you got to move forward. I like Lee's approach of putting it on the ballot, having the town vote on it, and then giving the town of Dennis a deadline of the fall. to join in. If not, we got to reverse course and pursue our own option. I think we're spending a lot of time, or in essence, wasting a lot of time talking about Harwich. Their preference has always been to tap into a Dennis-only plant. It mirrors what they're doing in Chatham. They don't want to own a plant, but they're willing to wait for one. And even if they just become a customer of one, like they are in Chatham, it would work out in their favor, both financially and politically. I'd rather not get hung up on dealing or speculating on 1% forgiveness or regional funding that, state funding that may flow to a regional project. It's worth remembering that the Chatham sewering got funded almost exclusively with federal funding because they were ready to go when the last infrastructure bills came out of the last recession. It may be worth us running ahead, getting ready for a single town solution and backing into federal government money that will be a lot more advantageous than whatever the state might be willing to forego in interest payments. So if I were to be recommending anything to the selectmen was stay the course. We don't mind the partnership if it's with two. I don't really care if it's with three. Yarmouth is bringing the discount to the project. We incur significant economies of scale just by doing our own plant because of the volume that we're generating ourselves. Dennis is piggybacking on our economy of scale to create a discount for themselves. So if they don't get that by the fall, they're not going to care how much of a discount it is because they have other issues. So I would rather see us just keep going rather than playing to somebody else's timetable. Giving them 6 months, probably fair, but I wouldn't spend a lot more time than that waiting on Dennis to join us.
Yeah, and that's my thought from the conversations that I've heard and been part of. It sounded like Dennis was kind of at this point is aiming for a fall town meeting, and other than again some personalities, I don't think there's a desire to not get this done. And you mentioned $1 million, but I think the debt forgiveness, the last time we had we had the big meeting a couple of years ago, I believe it was more like 7 million. Does that sound right to anybody else?
You know, there's nothing more expensive than a discount. That's just something I learned.
Nothing's for free. Free isn't free.
Nothing is more expensive than going shopping with your wife at Macy's when they're having a sale. So I wouldn't, we're trying to count the $1 million savings when there potentially could be several $100 million in construction funding from the federal government. But you got to be there and asking for it and ready to go because It's not going to last forever. Right. And they're not going to earmark it. They're going to start passing it out to whatever projects are going to be ready. So if you want to wait another year, we're stuck. Getting to the back of the line again. And we're not sure what that's going to look like. Aside from anything else, most of today's discussion was taken up yet again by where we're going to discharge an effluent that we haven't created yet. So can we please just talk about getting this project going and then decide where we're going to put the discharge later? If nothing else, if we end up with a single town solution, we're pushed off the Bass River conversation for 10 or 15 years. And we can settle all that stuff well after all of us are gone. But at least we would have moved ahead on the primary objective here, which is to start treating our wastewater.
Yeah, because I'm still disappointed that we didn't do our own thing going on 10 years ago. Because I remember we talked about, even back in that day, the shovel-ready projects potentially. And, of course, it didn't happen. So I would think, Davis mentioned this before, is that the existing plans for the western end of Route 28 are pretty much there. Like he said, where's the pumping station? Which direction does it pump to? So, I imagine with some tweaking, that'd be pretty easy to get those plans into action if we end up at Buck Island Road, let's say, for a treatment plant. So I don't want anybody to jump to a decision today unless they really feel comfortable. If you'd like to have another meeting in a week or two to digest this and maybe ask more questions, that's fine. And then we'll go back to the selectmen with a recommendation. I think another question that came up in our discussion is if we decided to recommend that we go ahead with approving, moving the agreement to the town meeting of this spring, would we arbitrarily change the dates of the agreement, say that January 1st and go on that basis and then see if Dennis would follow suit in the fall?
You mean
'Cause I think-
unilaterally change dates?
July 1st right now. Dave or Jeff, any idea?
To be honest, I don't think we're ever going to get Harwich. So the DHY agreement as it is probably isn't going to come to pass. We'll probably be doing something bilateral with those guys. So the dates are going to come and go. It's really the decision to move forward as a partnership.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I'm just trying to think of the options that were put out there for us. Continue with DHY, do a YD agreement, or do a Y on our own. So I don't know how everybody else feels. I think if we say, you know what, DHY, we're done with it because we cannot afford to wait any longer, that's fine with me. We're not making the decision. We're making recommendations to the selectmen. So again, I'm just one person on the committee, so I'd love to hear what everybody else thinks about these potentials. Mr. Durkin.
Mr. Chair,
Tom Durkin. You know, one thing that we really haven't talked about at all, but insightfully was brought up by Lee, was the issue of litigation. I attended a meeting back in 2010 at the community college, and there was a representative, a lawyer from the Conservation Law Foundation, and he made a statement that if the Cape does not move forward with wastewater treatment, there was this very strong possibility of a suit from the Conservation Law Foundation. And the reaction of the people there, as I could see it, was, oh, no, this is not, oh, that's dumb. They're never going to sue us. And if you look at the progress, it's been inexorable as far as the Conservation Law Foundation is concerned. They have sued, as the article recently published in the Cape Cod Times, they've gone against the EPA, they've gone against the state of Hawaii, they've gone against Barnstable, they've gone against two Harwich resorts. And Lee asked the question, are they going to go against Yarmouth? My response is definitely yes. Who's next? Yarmouth as a community, and then the people on the Cape are going to be charged legally to replace their present septic systems to reduce the nitrogen contamination of our soil. That is something that we have to consider. I think the most irresponsible statement was made by Mr. McCormick, who is a Dennis selectman. And he said, I quote, possible litigation is a concern, but we're doing and moving forward. We'll be fine. We won't be fine. Thank you, Kirk.
Jeff, you started to speak.
Mr. Chair, if I,
Go ahead, Spiro.
I appreciate Tom's passion and concern about getting sued, but probably the best thing that could happen to all of us is that the Conservation Law Foundation sues us as soon as possible so we can move forward on one of these two options that are on the table. Otherwise, our partners are going to be dragging. It's not likely they're going to be suing people left and right. I was curious why they didn't sue us as part of the Lewis Bay lawsuit, because we share that watershed, and they didn't do that. They're picking their targets here and there. As soon as they see there's some progress, they're going to look away. We're trying to make progress. We're trying to get a plant built. We disagree exactly where we're going to put it, but we know we have to do it. We know we're going to put the pipes in regardless of where the plant is. And all we're really arguing about today is, we're trying to save some money to build a joint plant, or are we looking at doing one ourselves? It would be slightly more expensive. I don't blame Dennis. If I'm Dennis, I'm looking around and saying, I can partner with Harwich and get some savings there and maybe sell some treatment to Brewster when it's their turn to show up with some effluent, and be right where they are today with a partnership with us.
Well, here's another thought.
Let's get sued. I don't mind.
I would, and I said this for the last 10 years, because we're not 5 years and 10 years behind. We're probably 2 generations behind in getting this done. We should not do this because somebody might sue us. We should do this because it's the right thing to do. And if you don't protect where you live, nobody's going to want to be here. To me, it's about that simple. You can cry about the cost, but when your property values start to fall because nobody wants to be near the water, which is probably one of the 2 reasons people come to Cape Cod, that and golf, what do you got? So whatever way we move forward, I agree with what's been said. We need to move forward sooner rather than later. And that's why I wish there was some better outreach. And as I get contact information from people in Dennis, I will have the conversation myself if some other people in this town are currently not willing to do it, and find out exactly how they feel about this and whether they're going to move forward. Jeff, you've been waiting. I don't want to hold you up any longer before you forget what you were thinking about.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to add to your comments that, recommendations don't have to be formulated today, but the time is relatively short. It's my understanding that the selectmen may take up this DHY discussion again at their April 27th meeting. They will need to decide about whether to pull an article off of the town meeting warrant or not. And so I'm sure by at least that time, they're going to be looking for a recommendation from the Water Resource Advisory Committee. And the only other thing I have to add is just to Tom Durkin's comments. I did have a personal conversation with a representative from Conservation Law Foundation, and I asked them what progress looked like to them, because I shared with them everything that Yarmouth was doing. And they said progress looks like to them pipes in the ground. So not just planning or discussions or agreements, they actually want to see pipes in the ground.
Okay, John, I think you were next.
Oh,
I'll get to you in a minute, George. I see you there. Go ahead, John.
I like the idea that you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, about potentially meeting in 1 week's time. I think, a synopsis of comments so far, there's a lot of support for a vigorous recommendation to the selectmen. Perhaps, I'm not sure the system and if it's most effective, emailing our own first, second, third choice questions to you, putting some kind of a aggregated email back to the committee that we all could take a look at, and then, have a meeting next week to talk through what would be the most effective first, second, and third recommendation to the committee. It appears to me that there's a lot of support for the recommendation to do something and soon.
Mm-hmm. I agree. George?
Yeah, I want to just support what Spiro is saying. This is long past due. And I think waiting for Harwich is a fool's errand. Why don't we move forward? Put something on the warrant this time with an ability to let Dennis make a decision within a well-defined period. But if not, we've got a plan already that just needs some tweaking. And let's move ahead with that with all deliberate speed. You said it, Kurt. We're 2 generations behind.
Yeah.
We just can't wait any longer. This needs to be done, whether we're going to be sued or not. And as I think a few of you have said, maybe getting sued is a good thing.
Yep.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
Yeah, Kurt, I think that one of the
Tom.
first questions that's going to be asked is, what's the difference, with Yarmouth going on its own or including an agreement with Dennis, money-wise?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's probably going to come up real soon, especially if you bring it before the selectmen. So, do we have any of those figures?
Well, Dave has presented those in the past, and, each town on their own versus each town as part of a tri-town agreement. So I imagine the worst thing that Dave has to do is just, if it hasn't been done, is just to update the Yarmouth only options, and you can put them side by side and see what they look like. Would that be correct, Dave?
Yeah, no, we would need to do the same level of detail that we've done on the most recent DHY. We have a lot of the pieces and components, but they need updates. So we would need to do that. So that's why I said we've done sort of back of the envelope without getting into that level of detail to show that it's very similar, but we don't have a table to present you now. It would have to be done.
Well, I think, again, once you start talking about alternatives, the question is going to be asked, what's the difference? To the layperson, people that aren't really into this, that want to be educated relative to what we're trying to accomplish.
When you keep bringing up
Tom Durkin, did you have your hand up?
No.
When you keep,
Okay, Spiro's next. I'll get to you, Lee.
when you keep talking about the discount, it keeps sounding like we're begging Dennis to give them the discount. If they don't want it, they don't want it.
Exactly.
I agree.
There's no discount unless we pipe water over to that plant.
Yeah.
If you look at the past presentations, most of our savings is in the operation and maintenance. So if to actually build this system, if the numbers hold, the trends, let's say, hold true, we're not going to see much difference in getting it in the ground. It's going to be later on. And again, that's going to be years and years and years of trying to work back that difference in the cost. Lee?
I still say that the regional approach is probably my first choice. Trying to get Dennis to move along with us and let the chips fall where they may as far as Harwich is concerned. I really think, we've got something very important in common here. We've got the Bass River, and there's been a lot of work being done by the Friends of Bass River, and the community is in favor of doing a lot for that concept. And to stay with Dennis and try to work out, a partnership is a really good way to do it, because we still get the opportunity of getting a regional approach to things, which is what DEP, the state, wants. And I think the community wants it. I think we really want to do this on a regional basis. Again, I just think we should try to do that. And I think Dennis will come along with us pretty easily. I think they're committed. They're just, for whatever reason, dragging their feet right now. And I don't think it's money. I just think, they're talking about, well, we want to give our community the opportunity to come together. Well, have an outdoor annual town meeting and give these people an opportunity to show up and say yay or nay. I mean, there's been so much advertisement and so much work being done to show how important this environmental aspect is. And having at least two communities work together. And the legislature worked really hard getting this agreement for the DHY. So I wouldn't throw that out the window just yet, but I would push to try and get Dennis and Yarmouth together, and maybe Harwich would start thinking about, maybe they ought to try to do something with us, because they're going to lose.
I agree. Dave?
Yeah, just to embellish a couple things. One, just to remind everybody, if you are in a lawsuit and you end up with an administrative order or anything like that, you do not qualify for 0% interest loans any longer. So you're back to 2.25%, something to keep in mind. Yes, it may push the project forward, but you would have a higher funding package, which may be the segue into Ed's presentation. But two, just a couple of things Lee brought up. Yes, you do share Bass River with Dennis, one of the largest watersheds, and you will be required to sign a watershed permit with Dennis. So you will be partnering on that anyway. That will be required by DEP. going forward, so that you both commit to removing, X pounds of nitrogen within your different communities to restore that water quality in that watershed. And 3, to Lee's point, Dennis is already holding an outdoor town meeting, as is Yarmouth, one of the reasons they're looking to delay. The issue is they don't have the time and the ability to hold in-person sessions to help educate the voters on what they consider to be one of the largest, if not the largest, funding programs that they would have to be committing to. So that's their concern. They have been hit very hard with COVID internally with staff. And, they were still holding hope for the 3-town partnership, but, maybe the consideration for the 2-town is there, and you could work that out in the summer and both hold your town meetings in the fall. But just wanted to clarify a couple items that we raised.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Kurt, did you mention earlier that you were going to try and reach out to someone in Dennis relative to, basically what we talked about this evening?
Yeah, like I said, I don't have phone numbers for some people, like Paul McCormick or Chris Flanagan or somebody else, selectmen, or even some of the water resources committee people in their town, because I think, and Dave and Jeff can correct me, but I don't think they will. I think the DHY process was a really good process. I think everybody got along really well. I think people brought up concerns and they were treated as legitimate and dealt with. And, we negotiated everything and, on a friendly basis and got to this point in the agreement. And that's why it's so disappointing that Howard has gotten such cold feet at the last minute, because again, they've had 4 years to get the numbers that they say they're concerned about. They've had plenty of time to get them together. And it's unfortunate that we went this far just to hit a roadblock. And I think again, my feeling with Dennis is, I think, for the majority of people involved in this process, they're all still on board. And I think it really is a COVID issue for them with outreach and the loss of staff, because Yarmouth has been pretty good at having staff be able to work remotely. And apparently Dennis does not really have that ability. So when people have to quarantine or they actually have COVID, they're off the field. They're not able to do anything. And apparently it's really affected their operations of the whole town, not just wastewater. Would you agree? Any comment, Jeff or Dave?
Yeah, no, I would agree. They've been getting complaints on some of the other programs they've been pushing forward that they haven't been able to hold the in-person meetings, very limited virtual meeting participation, and what have you. So that's what they're basing their comments on.
Yeah, I would agree, Kurt. I think your synopsis of that is exactly what we've been talking about with the DHY subgroup and the representatives we had discussions with is exactly what you said.
Okay, I think all that was just the update. Do we have any debt service items available tonight? I don't see where Ed's here.
Yeah, Ed should be there. Hopefully he's prepared to talk a little bit about this, but what was distributed by Kyle was a PDF of kind of what the cost recovery looks like, or the project funding sources. And then there was also an Excel spreadsheet that was distributed as well. So if individual members of the committee would like to, play with some of the numbers to see what that looks like and does to the overall equation, that's why that was distributed as well. So this is something we've been working with as town staff for quite a while. And I think the reason why it was held to now to share with the committee was to make sure we had the updated numbers, which we do. That was from the memos that I covered earlier. So I don't know if Ed is on board and wants to talk about this a little bit more.
Yes, I'm on board.
Okay.
Listening to it diligently. I do want to make some comments about price inflation. Yeah, that's hit us hard based on the initial numbers that we had for this plan. I think many of you know that after the 2011 failed vote, we started working on the ability to fund a wastewater project without real estate taxes. We are going to use some taxes as I'll illustrate. But one of the plans that we worked on a few years before Dan Knappich came on board was actually putting a plant in Yarmouth on Buck Island Road and actually taking waste from Dennis and treating Dennis's waste. So we spent a lot of time on that particular option. So if we're looking at a two-town option, that's also one of the options that's in play as well, or could be considered. And that allows us to move forward quickly without having to bring on other folks. The only reason that Dennis is a great site is because of Harwich. And if Harwich does pull back, then we can consider that option as well. Again, I'm concerned with delaying and the tens of millions of dollars it's costing us every time we do delay. So that's just a precursor to what we might be talking about. So what I want to do is just share my screen, and I do want to share the spreadsheet as opposed to the PDF in case we do want to do some what if analysis as we're discussing things. And I tend to be conservative. I try not to present numbers that don't seem realistic. So what I want to do is just go over the structure of the spreadsheet. Dave's updated numbers, and Dave can correct me if I'm wrong, and so can Jeff. I think the project cost is now up to $146,800,000. $132,000 of that could be SRF eligible, whereas $14.8 million are not. The design and engineering costs are not SRF eligible, so we would have to pay debt service, including interest expenses on that particular portion of the project. What I have is a number of different columns that would be potentially utilized for the payment of the debt service, and then at the bottom of the document are explanations about what's included in those columns. So what I did was based on where we are, what we have for the reality of the situation. I aggressively said of the $3.25 million that could be utilized for infrastructure stimulus funds from the federal government, that perhaps we put $3 million, but if we have better results in some of the other columns, then we could potentially decrease that number and utilize that number for other items that are related to our infrastructure. But obviously this is the most important project, I believe. So I would think most of that funding would come to this project. The next column, and we have discussions about what will happen to new growth and how quickly that will happen. Just put in, as Jeff said, put in a stake in the ground for discussion. As Jeff indicated, if this were changed to 25%, then this number will change throughout the model. So what I wanted to avoid was somebody leaves in the town and other people cannot update the model. I want this to survive anybody. My guys say, I can't say get hit by a bus, but I can say that if I win the lottery and I'm not here, that somebody else should be able to pick this model up. The next column was short-term rental tax. I don't know if we're getting a COVID premium right now, where people are fleeing potentially the cities or other congested areas, or are leaving New England to come to the Cape as opposed to going overseas or going to the West Coast or the South. And are we the beneficiaries of that? So I think we're going to get about $1.2 million when all things shake out at the end of this fiscal year. But are we going to have that same level of income going forward? So again, I'm not trying to present a best case scenario. I'm not necessarily trying to present a worst case scenario, but I want to be conservative. Then we talked about Cape Cod Energy Park. Jeff mentioned one of the components today, which was the anaerobic digester. And what we're doing is we're looking at a project where the lease has been signed, and we're looking at another project where the lease hasn't been signed. First year we get construction or money during the construction, which is rarely done. And then we would get income stream throughout that process. And I do want to maybe get some support for that project. So I just want to actually put up a PDF of some notes related to that project. And this is a document related to the project, or the second solar project. So as a result of going through and re-engineering the septic facility, we looked at opportunities such as the anaerobic digester, the solar, different solar arrays, batteries, and even biofuels. The solar and the anaerobic digester and the batteries will probably shake out. And I wanted to indicate that we will be cutting down trees, but as part of that cutting down of the trees, we'd get $13.6 million over 20 years. And the solar project does not stop after 20 years. It just does not produce as much income. The amount of carbon that is taken out of the atmosphere is equivalent to 6,639 acres of forest every year. So again, as it relates to reducing the number of trees we might have on that location. And then the way the project is being done, we're also going to do a 1.8 cent reduction in low-income individuals' rates for electricity. And we'll be utilizing $10,000 of tree planting over 5 years as a part of the revenue that's produced. But what the downside is that the trees at 50 Workshop Road would be removed. Again, we would plant trees elsewhere, and this would be the new solar footprint as well as around the bend of this particular project. So we're working on the lease right now. I've talked to 3 of 5 selectmen and want to talk to 2 more just to ensure they know what the impacts are and what the benefits are. They've seen this memo. We just have to, pull the trigger on that in order to actually utilize that money in column F to help fund the wastewater project. And then we have a demand mitigation type project potentially that might have batteries. And then Jeff talked about the anaerobic digester. We have our IMA ready for contracting with other towns, and we're going to be looking to get the feedstock, which would include the biosolids from wastewater treatment plants. I have not put that money in here. We're also going through the surplus land or the foreclosed land that we have to look for opportunities to sell some of those properties. I didn't put revenue here. So we continue to look for other revenue sources to bolster the amount of money that we have for this project in case any of the revenue sources don't pan out as well as we thought. We're still looking for those revenue sources and hopefully utilizing revenue sources for the next set of phases. Then we have, we have to get a vote on the ballot to approve the CPA exemption so that we can start generating that CPA money. There was a plan to combine all of the enterprise funds into one enterprise fund. We don't need to do that in order to take money out of the septic facility, the retained earnings that we have all generated, Jeff and his team, and so folks on our team to rework the septic facility. We're now profitable in that area. So we can take $100,000 a year out of the septic facility retained earnings. And if we get the anaerobic digester, we could get a longer term set of revenue streams out of the septic facility because we're really driving down the cost of that facility. Then we look at the Cape Cod Water Protection Trust. This is that group giving back to Yarmouth the money that its taxpayers have generated based on having Yarmouth buildings generate more short-term rental money. So I would see that we would start getting that money back. I'm trying to be conservative, but any dollar that we have provided from Yarmouth properties to generate that tax really should come back to Yarmouth. Then we have some of the assumptions that we had before about getting betterments. probably about 11 years ago, I built a wastewater model that, are you still seeing the spreadsheet? Did you lose that? Okay, let me bring that back up again.
Spreadsheet wasn't shown, Ed. You still had the plan.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you seeing it now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I just went through quickly the columns, the $3 million from the stimulus funds, the betterments. If I change that to 25%, if you guys want to do some what if scenarios, that will actually change the model. My apologies. Short-term rental assumptions, starting with $1.2 million. But again, that could be a COVID premium. So I reduced that somewhat. Again, if that is the same type of return we continue to get, then that's great. Although we don't want to jeopardize our hotels and motels, their earning stream either. So that could hurt us as well if we don't get both sources of revenue. And then the Cape Cod Energy Park, phase 1 of the solar. This is phase 2 of the solar from that project, from the memo you saw. Then we're looking at demand mitigation at the septic facility, utilizing battery technology and additional solar, the anaerobic digester, the sale of foreclosed and other land to generate revenue, the exemptions from the CPA going to the wastewater funding, then $100,000 a year for some number of years from the septic facility. We have a host fee that we've had for a number of years. We can just reactivate that host fee and divert that money right to the wastewater fund. Then this is the Cape Cod Water Protection Collaborative. Again, money that our taxpayers are generating that's going into their coffers that, you know, ideally should come back to us. The betterments, we're looking at, I just did a conservative $300,000 a year. Back in 2011, we did a modeling tool that would allow us to actually test what the betterments would be for each one of the customers. And that'll be produced soon so we can see how much each individual would have to pay for a betterment and make sure from a sniff test standpoint, that still seems reasonable. The same thing with the water charges for the O&M, but with a 25% capital surcharge. Again, these are things that we've been working on since 2011, a large team of us working on this. We talk about capital or debt forgiveness, 25%. We don't know if that's going to happen, so I didn't plug those numbers in. If that happens, again, that's additional money for future phases. This would be the debt service over 30 years for the $132,000 of money that hopefully is SRF eligible. Column Q or column 17 would be the amount of debt service that we have to pay first for Route 28 for the $3 million we're going to borrow for the design and engineering, and then for the actual long-term borrowing of the design and engineering costs for the project. What you'll see, and don't get concerned about column R, this is why we want to pre-fund. We want to build up funds before we actually get into the project. So you'll see negative, but as long as column S doesn't have a negative value, we're fine with the project because we have enough funding in the bank to actually pay for our debt service. And I also wanted to just point out at the bottom, there's more detail about each one of the columns for your information. And are there any questions or any comments, or do you want to change any numbers to see how this actually flows differently based on different assumptions that we might make?
Anybody else have any comment?
Ed, I just want to point out these costs you're using are for the DHY alternative.
Got it.
It's not for the town only alternative, which would be higher.
Understood. Understood. So we'll have to revise this. And, you know, again, we're looking at these revenue sources, and all we have to do is change this number to see what that looks like. And what we need to do then is we need to, and, you know, I know that we get more points for being in a regional project, but the possibility of getting an SRF loan still exists. The possibility potentially to work with Barnstable instead of Harwich potentially still exists. So, we can still try to work a regional project with a wastewater treatment plant and effluent disposal at Buck Island. If, for example, Harwich drops out of it, we don't want to lose $1 million or $550,000 that's in the state legislation. But as Kurt indicated, or the chairman indicated, perhaps we can have that money reassigned in an upcoming, set of legislation that might come forward for the town.
Okay, so my comment on the short-term rental tax, and like you said, I know you've talked about conservative estimates, is that I have one of the real estate people I know said they actually lost some rental units because people have decided to move down here and live in the unit that they formerly rented. So I think considering things like that and a weather event year could drastically affect those numbers, hopefully for just a year. But I think it's good to stay conservative with those numbers so that you can ride out those ups and downs that might happen. I think a couple of years of history will tell us what the trends will be too.
Exactly. Yes. And I totally agree with you. But the thing about this is a portfolio of revenues. This is somewhat like our local receipts. If one set of revenues is down, hopefully we've designed this portfolio to be broad enough to have other revenue sources that can pick up the slack. So we could look to, the septic facility to pick up some slack in a particular year based on a host fee that we might allocate to the septic facility. And hopefully some of the sources of revenues that are blank at this point in time do come to fruition. In addition, we can put in things in column 2, such as free cash allocations, or we can use overlay reserves or other, one-time sources of funding to bolster up this revenue. And there was mention that, perhaps if we can move along fast enough, we can be in a position to take advantage of additional stimulus funds. If the Democrats use the reconciliation option, and the second one that they can use over a 1-year period and push through a stimulus fund, or if they can get the Republicans on board, we may be in line for getting stimulus money, which might offset, a particular direction that we might head in. And, moving faster, again, I think we had numbers of, 75 or 80% or 75 or $80 million on a partial Route 28 plant construction on a go it alone, back in 2010. Now it's up to, and then it moved up, significantly from there, and now we're up to 140 million. So those points about delaying the project are, very much well taken, because, the escalation of these numbers have just dramatically increased over time.
Is there an
And,
appetite for putting the three? Sorry. Is there really any indication from anyone they're willing to put aside $3 million of stimulus money for this?
There isn't.
Because that's exactly where the $5 million surplus in the first year comes from, right?
The 5 million? Oh, in the first year. Well, that's much of it. Yes, it is. In addition to that, though, I think you also have to know that the Barnstable County received $5 million of money that was given to them based on the town of Yarmouth population. So
Understood,
I think there's a possibility that we could also request money, not use the full $3 million, and get some money from Barnstable County.
Right, but technically, but you're technically saying not use the $3 million. Doesn't the federal government have something to say about not spending the $3 million they're giving us to stimulate?
I'm saying that we wouldn't necessarily spend all of that money for this one project potentially. We also have coastal infrastructure, we have our water infrastructure, and we have broadband that is also part of the legislation that we could spend the money on. So if we did get money from other sources and we had those projects ready to go, then those might be, and Jeff Colby is obviously ready to go with water types of projects, those are other alternatives. Again, I'm thinking that, in the notes below, that we should make a big effort to try to go after some of those county funds as well. If they've got $41 million in funding, and that's about, more than their entire one-year budget, as opposed to the $3 million we're getting, which is, I don't know, one.
So I get what you're suggesting. I'm just saying, is there a valid argument to be made for taking stimulus money and putting it somewhere else for a period of 3 years, not spending it? And by the way, would they let you get away with that when the audit comes around a couple of years from now?
We can spend it immediately because we got $3 million in money that we need to spend on Route 28. Actually, $5.25 million. We can spend this immediately.
I understand. But how do you get to $5 million in the final column?
So it's 3 million plus 1.2 million in short-term rental, plus $500,000 in CPA money, plus $100,000 in septic hose fees to generate the $5 million.
I get a spreadsheet. I see how it adds from left to right. I'm just saying, at the same time, you're saying we're saving and spending $3 million. Which is it?
I don't know that I said save $3 million.
Well, how does it turn into a surplus if you spend it?
So
in other words, we're banking all these other columns of revenues we're banking.
Yeah,
we're not spending.
In June, we allocated $5.25 million to the Route 28 project. We haven't yet borrowed those funds. So I'm saying that if you're concerned that the state would not allow us, or the federal government would not allow us to put this in the bank, we could substitute the $3 million. We still have the debt service that we could utilize for other projects in the future, and we could spend that immediately. I'm just saying that, if that's a concern that you have, or that others would have, with the federal government telling us that we haven't spent it fast enough. Was that clear? I'm sorry.
No, I understand. I'm just saying it. We're looking at a project that's trying to create a surplus heading into the heavy construction years in 7, 8, 9, and 10.
Yes.
So we can spend down that surplus. In other words, we're saving, to build a project. I get it. But when somebody gives you the money to spend and you say, I'm saving it instead, is when you run into a problem.
Yeah, I didn't say saving. That was kind of your term. What I said was that we could actually spend this money in the first year. We could spend this in 2021 and 2022 if we chose to.
It would reduce that. It would reduce column 16 though, right? I mean, the final.
That would reduce column 16, but we would substitute the borrowing that we would do that the town meeting authorized.
Okay.
To fund the remaining part of the project.
A couple of other things you can think of in this is that I don't want to re-engineer the project for Dave, but there are things that were included because we were going to Dennis. So Old Main Street had a pressure main going up it, and that's when I suggested that maybe we should plan on putting a pipe in for sewers at the same time we get the road dug up. Well, maybe or maybe not, that changes. If we get in a huge jam, maybe we back off on South Shore Drive for now. There's things we can do to keep this project moving, no matter, in my opinion, no matter what. I think we have a little bit of flexibility here and there that, if necessary, could back off some of the costs. Because I think the other thing to really, it's going to be a problem later on is fuel costs apparently keep going up, or at least they've started to. So if that's a trend that's going to last a few years, when these projects get bid and these big trucks need fuel and the equipment, and then you got to put you've got the fuel that goes into the asphalt paving, all those costs are going to go up again. So,
right.
Those are things to think about. I think there's ways we could shave costs off if we had to. I don't want to, but if we have to, I think we can do that.
And Kurt, to your point, that's the same concept we talked about as it relates to wastewater. Once we put in wastewater facilities and we start looking at the nitrogen and looking at what happened with the Parker's River Bridge widening and some of those other things, then we would have an adaptive strategy for the wastewater plan. Exactly to your point, we can have an adaptive financing plan as well. But these are the pillars of that financing plan right now, but we can tap into other sources of funding as well.
Okay, anybody have any more comments or questions? Jeff, I have a question for you that I thought about when Ed mentioned Parker's River. I assume we've been having ongoing water quality testing there, and are we going to, I assume it's going to continue and we can watch the trend of the water quality from as a before and after scenario?
Yeah, good question. We have some ongoing water monitoring that's going on there, but there's also other monitoring that APCC is doing as one of our project partners, Association for the Preservation of Cape Cod. They're actually doing some measuring of the salt marsh and different benchmarking tools to make sure that we're actually seeing other improvements, but water quality is one component, yes.
Yeah, I found it interesting that they opened the river up right on time for the full moon tide. It really looked impressive watching that much water flow underneath that bridge.
Right, that's one of the other updates I wanted to make sure the committee was aware of, that that's open to the full width now for the water passing through, and it's still ripping through there, but it's doing its job.
And I see the decking was being put on today, or I guess you'd call it the decking of the bridge itself.
Right, for the north side, yes.
Okay, anything else on the financing plan? Okay, just like everything else, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. Us as a committee being informed is the best way to keep this project moving forward. Do you have anything else, Ed, on your end?
No, just the fact that we'll start testing the model and the water charges as soon as I finish the modeling that utilizes our water database and our assessing database to get the acreage and the water usage, historical water usage. And then I think we need to do some type of outreach to those businesses to make sure that those expenses seem to be within reason for them. I think, obviously you all know that this should be less costly than the money that a lot of these people have had to put in the bank to actually mitigate wastewater once there was a solution in place and or do their own facilities. So, I'm anticipating that whatever we charge for betterments or, water charges are going to be okay, but I think we need to do some testing with some customers to make sure that there's no outrage over whatever these numbers might be. And then, the testing might also indicate that potentially, the amounts are low. So, that might be another way to kind of, look to update this model. But this is a model that's, needs to change over time as we learn more and we get actual results. And as Kurt, as you indicated, we see a trending from the short-term rentals. We have 1 year right now, so that doesn't help with. We have 3/4 of a year right now. That doesn't help with it with good trending.
The other thing is on the betterments. I believe we talked about certain aspects of this program being charged out over, say, 30 or 35 years at a low interest rate. Would that also apply to commercial properties?
I think betterments are usually, and I got to recheck it, and I have a document on betterments that I'll release to everybody. Just the latest advisory from the state. I think often it's 20 years, but I want to see how far it can go out, how long that period can be.
I would still think that borrowing through us as opposed to borrowing through a bank is still a better deal, but
much better.
I just want to understand that option could be open to them so that, if you say $300,000 to somebody, they fall over. You say $300,000 over 30 years to a business person, they're probably going to be happy.
And this would be $9 million total over the course of 20 years. Is it 20 years? Oh, I'm sorry, this was 30 years. Over the course of 30 years, divided by the number of people on Route 28.
Right.
And I propose, because we have the data, I'm going to run the model using an acreage option so that we don't have to go through special legislation to get some type of other option to assess betterments. That's the path of least resistance. But if people want to do something different, then we might need to get special legislation. And then the wastewater, the model will be updated to do it based on water usage. And then we've, again, with Dave Young, we've talked about this for years, how much of that is sprinkler systems that will be put on separate meters once we start charging based on water usage. So, a lot of those things are being factored out so that we can try to get to a good number.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I believe we the Friends of Bass River is next.
Thank you. Thank you, Kurt. I'm Bob Churchill. I'm a co-founder and also co-chair of the board of Friends of Bass River. And first of all, I wanted to thank the committee members personally as a longtime business owner and a resident of Yarmouth for all your incredibly hard work on this and just striving towards a mitigation of a well-known problem that's now really kind of on the front of, thanks to you all, on the front of a lot more people's minds than it used to be. Our executive, and I want to thank you on behalf of Friends of Bass River for inviting us to collaborate with you and for putting us on your agenda at your regular meetings. Our executive director, Rick Bishop, is currently recovering from a successful surgical procedure, but he's resting pretty well to the best of my knowledge. Our co-chair, Aaron McCarty, has been working, because of my full-time employment, Aaron has been working more closely with him on the Upper Bass River Watershed Restoration Project, which has been ongoing and which is moving along very nicely. And Aaron, I'd like to invite Aaron to share some bullet points and updates on where we are with that at this point. Aaron, if you could jump in here.
Sure. We've been meeting regularly, biweekly with our consultants. We're still working with the Woods Hole Group, Tie and Bond, and Interfluve. Woods Hole Group has completed their studies, title studies, and other related studies. And basically now we're down to Tie and Bond working on the both the Crab Creek bridge there at North Dennis Road, and also the bridge at Weir Road, which is probably the sort of the largest question mark in the whole project, as I'm sure Jeff Colby can attest. And I believe that we are waiting for Tie and Bond to come back to us with their final recommendations for the bridge span. And Jeff probably could speak to some of that better than even I could, because I know you've been in some of those side meetings. I do know that we have applied for money, working with that the town has applied for money to fund some of the project related to particularly the Weir Road Bridge, to help the town fund the replacement project of that bridge. In terms of the restoration area itself, we're working very closely with Interfluve, and we have a few draft copies of what our restoration area might look like. We have been working with both Jeff and Department of Conservation in Yarmouth to talk about things like access, trail width, locations of parking, and other issues. I think that it's going very well. The restoration area looks very promising and very doable from a financial standpoint, and we are already working on securing funding for the sort of next steps in the project. And we do plan to have a sort of an unveiling of what the restoration area project will look like in the early fall. We are hoping to have an in-person symposium as we've done in years past, but we are planning on putting it off to the fall, and by that time our restoration plans will be complete. So it's been a while since you all have toured the restoration area. We're happy to share the plans with all of you and to take you on a tour. As Bob said, Rick had very successful heart valve transplant surgery the other day, and he has been texting me through this whole meeting asking me what's going on. So I'm sure you'll be hearing from him. But that's where we are with our restoration. I did want to speak a little bit to what's going on in the last week. I unfortunately I sat through the Yarmouth Selectmen's meeting before I sat through the Dennis Selectmen's meeting, and I'm sort of catching up on things. I am also, in full disclosure, I've got a dog recovering from surgery. But I did listen to the Dennis meeting, and Paul, I don't want to read too much into what the selectmen had to say, but the issues of COVID we've talked about, and the situation that the town has gone through in relation to their ability to get work done. I would like to not read too much into the fact that there may be something behind it, and just assume that they're doing it for those reasons. It is my intention, as I was speaking to Bobby, to reach out to the selectmen and to Paul specifically to talk to them about our commitment at Friends of Bass River to educating all of the residents of both towns regarding the DHY partnership, as we've done. We continue to be committed to this being at least a 2-town partnership because the river lies between you, and that's us. And we do think that it is the right thing for the river. So we do plan to reach out, and I completely agree that your communication with them, rather than he said, she said, or we think, they think, is really the way to approach this. I mean, so far as we know, that everybody's been getting along up until this point. So I think a further discussion from the 2 towns, again, as a Dennis resident speaking to Yarmouth residents, that's what I will be urging my selectmen to do, is to have a conversation. So that's all I have. If anybody has any questions.
A thought came up. I know it's usually a Carl von Hohn question, but have you talked to Dennis about their part in dredging the river? My understanding is that they're responsible for the northern part of the river. Last we had heard it got delayed because they were concentrating on trying to get the Seward Harbor back open. I some of their attention on the river.
We did have a meeting with the town engineer and with DPW in Dennis, which was a real watershed event for us, because it's been such a difficult, and I'll say this, I know Kyle's from Dennis too. It's been difficult to make inroads into the town. And again, I'm speaking as a Dennis resident myself. There's 4 of us on the board who are Dennis residents. We're not a Yarmouth-based organization. And we're really working hard to make friends and influence people in the town hall of Dennis. We did not talk about the dredging. They were very quick to talk to us about their improvements that they're making to the landings. I know that they're working at High Bank right now, which is something that was a little bit of a bone of contention on the Waterways Committee in Dennis, that they weren't paying enough attention to the river. And they're also working on some stormwater projects that they received grants for. We did not get into the dredging discussion. Certainly that's something that we will talk to them about. We did talk about the highway bridge, which I know is on everybody's mind. And we did talk about the widening of the railroad bridge as well, once the highway bridge, is under construction. So we will, the next meeting with them, talk about dredging for sure.
Yeah, I'm not putting it on you. I was just curious as to whether that had been
No,
any.
no, we didn't. Again, they sort of, we started to have a conversation, and then they sort of steered it, I think, in the direction that they wanted to go in terms of letting us know what they were working on actively. So, I mean, and it was a very positive meeting, working with them on our commitment to the river and explaining to them what we were doing on the Yarmouth side. We're committed to expanding that sort of project over here into the Weir Creek area of Dennis to do a similar restoration project. And we talked about culvert issues that we have over here. Again, that's, this is the first conversation we've been able to get in the door with them to have. So that was very encouraging. But I did, if you listened to the Dennis town meeting, I do have an issue, and I've been talking to Rick about it with one of the members of the Dennis Conservation Commission, who was quoting our data, our initial test data, as a means to discuss doing future studies, and also perhaps the fact that perhaps the Dennis side isn't as bad as the Yarmouth side. That was sort of the impression I got. That's not that, we haven't made our data public. We haven't made our testing data public. And we actually do, just for the record, have some issues with the data around Kelly's Bay that will need to be corrected this year with our testing. But we are committed to testing. We have everyone coming back from last year. We have 2 additional sites that we're adding, which is Grand Cove, and then an additional site down here in the near the West Dennis Yacht Club areas, particularly developed since the MEP report was done. And we had overall great results. We had a meeting with the Center for Coastal Studies to review our data, and we got some good numbers. So we feel good that first year, as short as it was, we were headed in the right direction. So, and we'll be thrilled in the fall to share our data with everyone. But I think our big is our commitment to DHY. To at least a 2-town solution, and to do whatever we can to help you and to help the town of Dennis to get the information out to people, especially in advance of these town meetings.
Okay, that's encouraging. The reason why I've included the Friends is because you have some influential people to start with, but I think because your main goal is the environmental issues that are surrounding the river, it really helps us get more information to, plug into what's being done here. So I thank you all for that.
Thank you.
Anybody
Thank
have
you.
questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Kurt.
Anybody have questions for the Friends? Okay, I think the next thing is our public outreach and next steps. Is that Dave or Jeff handling that?
I can start, and then David could maybe fill in some of the details, but I think we mentioned this at the last meeting. Generally, what we're targeting is a mailing for the town meeting article. Given that is still somewhat in flux, we're going to need to adjust that document based upon what actually is going to happen with the town meeting article. And then the second and more definitive outreach component is the postcard for the ballot questions, of which the committee, as the committee knows, there are 2, the WIF and the CPA exemption. And so those are kind of the 2 overall pieces, depending on exactly which way we go this spring. And David, I don't know if you wanted to comment more about the content.
Just that we sent drafts of both to Curly Printing, one to get quotes for pricing for printing and for doing the mailings. And 2, it was suggested to try to get some of his expertise for some of the content and the layout that we have drafted, and received some comments back from town staff, but to try and get some input there. So once we get that back and we get the numbers finalized, one of the there's 2 concepts for the mailing, which would be good to get input from the committee. One was to do the postcard, which is again for the ballot question, to send that just to voters in town who have either been to town meeting or been voting in elections for the last 3 years, as opposed to sending it to every resident in town. There's over 7,600 or something residents that would need to have it sent to if we did it that way versus it's under 500, I think, for the other, or somewhere in that range. I'm still waiting to get the numbers, so don't quote me on those. But so there's two different concepts there. If we did the brochure for the town meeting article, which conceivably regarding DHY may wait until the fall or whatever the town decides to do now. That would be a much larger mailing and printing, and we'd probably do it similar to the way it was done prior to last fall's special town meeting. We go in a specific envelope with the full brochure. I think we've shared the DHY brochure before. We're trying to make that a little less wordy, update the information, so it's much more readable. So any thoughts on that would be certainly welcome. And once we get those and get that input back, we'll certainly share it with the committee.
So both Chairman and Dave, half of all of our ratepayers, half of all of our taxpayers don't go to town meeting, don't vote. We don't want to let them know what's going on.
No, I think it was geared towards the ballot question of those voting on the ballot and educating those versus those who don't care about a ballot. But that's why we're looking for input versus sending it to everybody.
I would send it to everybody. And then you don't get the complaints that they didn't know about it. We excluded them from knowing about it, or whatever it is that we're sending to the ones who live here year round, possibly, or the ones who vote, which is an even smaller proportion. Talking about the difference of what, it's 10,000 households we mail in Dens. We mail in Yarmouth.
It's probably in that range.
Yeah, I think the number of it might have been a little bit higher, closer to 14.
It's 14. Dennis is 10. Yeah, you're right. Dennis is 10. We're 14. I'm just saying, you get almost half of all your tax revenue from people who don't live here, and half of all residences are from people owned by people who don't live here. You probably should tuck something into their tax bill, if nothing else.
Tom had his hand up, Tom Barron.
Yeah, the recent article in Cape Cod Times, both in Dennis and in Harwich, they're talking about people wanting more information. So this is where it's got to be effective. What Spiro said, send it to everyone. Yes, by all means, but it's got to be tailored so that we get as much coverage, as much information out as possible. It may be a little bit more expensive, but it's got to be done. You can't leave any gaps in the information. Otherwise, this whole thing is just going to wither on the vine.
John?
I think Tom and Sparrow are both right. I think sending it to everybody is the way to go. All property owners.
Yeah, I mean, you could cost save by mailing postcards with web addresses where they can get more information. But if they're not getting something in the mail, you're going to create opponents just because they feel excluded.
Right.
I think the other consideration is, like I mentioned earlier about some of the summer rentals being lost, is some of these people are, like I said, they're moving here. They may not have voted in the past, obviously, but maybe they are registering to vote because they are here, and it would be a good idea to reach out to them. So I guess it sounds like the consensus of the committee is to try and do a full-blown mailing to all addresses in town.
Correct.
Okay. And I guess, I know, like I said, and Dave just mentioned, he's been working on the ballot mailer. It's been getting edited a little bit, so we should know about that soon. I think the thought that DHY wasn't going to hit the spring town meeting kind of held that off. So depending on what the selectmen decide in the next 2 weeks, we'll probably determine whether we need to do outreach at a town meeting level too, because I believe the only thing wastewater related is just the DHY vote in the town meeting. The other two issues are ballot votes. And I think, the other thing too is the traveling road show, if you would call it that, for lack of a better term, is pretty much impossible. And I think the attraction to people for us would not be that great. So if something like that was going to happen, I would encourage the selectmen to post it, and maybe we have a committee / selectmen's meeting that has outreach and invites comments and questions from the public. And, if we're going to do that kind of a thing, that might be the best way to do it. I don't know what everybody else thinks, but just my thought, my idea.
Just as an FYI, speaking of traveling roadshow, Jeff and I did present to the Yarmouth Rotary Club last Friday morning. So on the DHY project and the cost updates.
I heard somewhere, yes, somebody's supposed to be presenting to the Board of Realtors. Is that true?
They had contacted me about trying to do some presentation. I believe it's April 14th.
So that helps. I wish that, I know you did it before, and I wish there was a better turnout, but I suppose any little bit that we can get the word out helps, especially with the realtors, because if they're answering questions to potential buyers, I think it would be helpful that they have accurate information to pass along. Okay. Another thought, I guess I haven't looked at it, but somebody sent me a link to Barnstable developing information now as to, if you look up an address on a website, it'll tell you when that property is proposed, I'll use the word, to be tied into the sewer systems. So maybe in the near, I don't want to say near, because we've got enough to do just to get this thing passed, but maybe we get past that, we can start to see where we think we're going to go next, and who's going to be, next in line to tie in, and generally what they're a better nail down of the cost per property owner. Okay, anything else on outreach? We have next steps. I guess we've already covered them too. We'll meet again. We'll make a recommendation to selectmen, and I suppose they'll determine our next steps.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
This is Mark Petruzzi. I'm over at Mill Pond Village.
Yep.
And, we've got that other little deal going with Barnstable. I just want an update so I can bring it up at our next homeowners meeting. Is there anything going on?
As far as what?
As far as the connection on Camp Street to Barnstable instead of the Yarmouth system.
It's news to me. Maybe Jeff knows better.
Well, the only other update that I have for the committee is that on the 31st, so in 2 days, town Yarmouth staff will be meeting with Barnstable staff to talk about the Watershed intermunicipal agreement. David Young mentioned it before as it related to a Dennis Watershed IMA that we need to enter into with Dennis. Barnstable's a little further along with their wastewater planning, and as Kurt just mentioned, is doing some outreach to residents about connection costs. And I listened to one of those meetings as well, and so they're moving forward. And one of the pieces of moving forward is, as we talked about earlier, DEP requiring that two communities with a shared watershed, this one being Lewis Bay, with Yarmouth and Barnstable, enter into a watershed IMA. So we'll have our very first discussions about that. I'm sure that'll be an ongoing dialogue. At that meeting, I'll ask them about their future wastewater plans, especially as it relates to Lewis Bay, which is what this gentleman is asking about, a property that kind of feeds into that. So part of that IMA discussion is how costs are going to be shared between the two communities, how much is going to be cleaned up within that embayment, those types of discussions. So it's an ongoing dialogue. I don't know of any immediate plans to do anything with a Yarmouth residents being serviced through Barnstable. But it's certainly something that's been considered in the past. I know the committee's aware that we did some studies about sending wastewater to Barnstable and then sending some, effluent back to Yarmouth to be recharged. So we have ongoing dialogues about how we can work together on wastewater. Like I said, the more pressing or more immediate discussion is going to be about the watershed agreement. And we'll certainly share that with the committee once we decide what the format's going to look like and have a little bit more substance to update the committee on. But as far as specific connections in Yarmouth, with Barnstable, I'm not aware of any immediate happenings in that regard.
At one of the, a number of the other meetings, there was discussion, someone was talking to me about that Barnstable wanted to put sewer lines in Willow Street as the construction is just starting there now. And they were supposed to put in some sewer lines. And once that was happening, they were interested to get all of the properties on the I guess it's the west side of Camp Street in Yarmouth because of the way the land runs. And we had talked about using we have a pump house here that we're using for our system and converting that over to your needs. And that's the last I understood the discussion went to. And I haven't heard anything in a long time.
Okay, like I said, I will talk with Barnstable about kind of their more immediate, plans. Sometimes those are, they're very active plans. As the gentleman was mentioning, that work that was just done with the closure of the railroad tracks at Yarmouth Road and Route 28 was done in order to not only replace the railroad tracks, which you can see on the surface if you travel over that, but also to put in some utility lines, some of which were wastewater related. In discussions with Barnstable previously, they were going to have a couple of spare conduits in there to support ongoing discussions with Yarmouth. But at this point, I don't know, if there are any concrete plans beyond just spare conduits in there for something that Yarmouth could use. They certainly have plans to service the Barnstable customers on the east side of that intersection.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass it along.
Another thing, and again, it relates to our phasing, is I know we talked in the past about Buck Island Road, because with your property and the Mayflower and one of the condominium associations, there's 3 treatment plants right there that I'm sure all 3 of you would rather not be in the treatment business. So that's always an option also. That
would make us very happy to get out of the wastewater business. Yes.
Yeah, we know. So, and again, I think Barnstable's conversations might be a little bit more long-term, because even though the intersection just got done, my understanding is that major rebuild of Yarmouth Road is actually a 5-year project. Imagine, as I understood, it's going to require a lot of land taking and certainly moving a lot of utilities when they finally get to that point.
Okay. All right. I will pass that information along, because I had discussed it with the other homeowners here in the past, and I'll just try to bring them up to date. Thank you.
Okay. Very good. Okay, we're up to future meeting dates and agenda items. Do we all think that next week would be a good time to meet? Do we think we'll have enough information to maybe make a recommendation to the Board of Selectmen? Dave, do you think it'd be far enough on a mailing for us to comment, or not that we have to, but?
Yeah, well, I would hope so. We're waiting for Mr. Crowe to get back to us, and I understand he's had some medical issues, so.
Is there a selectmen's meeting between now and then? No, so the purpose is to meet so we can make a recommendation for the next selectmen's meeting?
The week after next. Well, I'm thinking we want to be prepared for, I think it's the 13th. I'm not sure the exact date. I'm not sure about next week, but the week after, I'm pretty sure they have a meeting. But actually, they have one tomorrow night, right? So they may skip next week and do the week after. So that would give us time to make a recommendation to them. And then they could put it on hopefully put on their agenda so that they could discuss whatever comes out of all this.
Kurt, for the whole month of April, selectmen are meeting every Tuesday.
Yeah, okay. So
6, 13, 20, and 27.
Because I know
I
that.
believe the 27th is their wastewater discussion.
Well, I think they also have, and I don't know what they have drop dead dates as far as warrant articles too, so they have to make a decision whether to move forward with putting an article in the spring warrant or leave it off, so.
So the motion is to have a meeting 1 week from today with a limited agenda. That's my motion.
Okay. Yeah, I know it's been a long meeting. I think it's been productive, but it's been a long meeting. That's fine. If we want to narrow it down to our recommendations for options between YD and DHY, that's fine with me.
We have to post it for a vote, so you might as well have one agenda item, DHY, and possible vote. And then after that, selectmen's discretion if you want to talk about anything else.
Okay.
Excuse me, chairman's discretion.
Do we have a second to hold the meeting next week with a limited agenda?
Okay.
John, okay. Any discussion on that? What we do for a meeting and when? Okay, I have to do a roll call, so all in favor? Tom Roach?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Tom Barron?
Yes.
Hero?
Yes.
Tom Durkin? Tom's muted.
Raise your hand.
Yeah, you can raise your hand, that's fine. Okay.
Okay.
And George Perkins?
Aye.
And myself say aye. Okay, so we'll try to keep it a short meeting next week. So you all have a job to do a lot of thinking this week. Again, if you have any questions, please reach out to Jeff, Dave, or run them through Kyle, whatever you need to do. But let's see if we can make an educated effort at this thing by next week. And I'll do what I can to reach out to others and see what they're really thinking. Like I said, I think there's some people in places trying to start a fight that, as far as I'm concerned, is not there, but I'd like to find out if it is or not. I think we have a set of meeting minutes to vote on.
I motion we accept the meeting minutes from February 22nd.
Okay, you have a second?
I'll second it.
All right, let's see who was here at that meeting. I vote aye. John DeLiso,
Aye.
Spiro,
Aye.
George,
Aye.
Tom Durkin,
Aye.
Lee Rowley. We lost Lee. Okay, so the minutes pass. I think we've got everything covered. I'm sure it's a moment you've all been waiting for. If anybody doesn't have anything else, how about a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second, do I have a second?
Second.